Need to check the names list carefully before writing. Looking at the file, names to avoid include Lauren, Daniel, Patricia, Rosie, Naomi, Marcus, Diane, Gloria, Mia, Cassie, Helen, Eleanor, Claire, Brianna, Audrey, Sandra, Vera, Gerald, Ivy, Philip, Fiona, Owen, Nora, Renata, Joel, Celeste, Serafina, Winifred, Rhett, Tessa, Derek, June, Stella, Celeste, Tatum, Barrett, Conrad, Trevor, Simone, Brooke, Ren, Emmett, Constance, Lynette, Adrian, Harrison, Penny, Petra, Ruth, Callie, Miles, Dottie, Hank, Veronica, Ronnie, Greta, Evelyn, Theo, Kay, Thomas, Zoe, Nadia, Isabel, Keely, Dex, Lottie, Raymond, Margot, Bennett, Colette, Adelaide, Lorraine, Margot, Bennett, Colette, Adelaide, Lorraine, Franklin, Sabrina, Darlene, Wesley, Priya, Natasha, Colton, Becca, Alden, Waverly, Nina, Donovan, Kara, Harriet, Audra, Elliot, Tobias, Maeve, Griffin, Sylvia, Lee, Joelle, Blythe, Caden, Paige, Alec, Corbin, Reese, Grant, Rowan. Now writing with fresh names, I'll use Meredith, narrator, Lacey, Coworker/Allie, Damon, husband, Brenda, mother-in-law, Kurt, brother-in-law type antagonist. The night everything fell apart, I was sitting on the floor of a hospital waiting room in a paper gown that kept slipping off my shoulder, holding a plastic cup of water that had gone cold an hour ago, trying not to cry in front of a stranger's kid who kept staring at me from across the room. I had called my mother. She picked up on the second ring, which felt like a good sign, and I told her where I was and what the doctor had said and that I needed someone to come. There was a pause. Not a long one. Just long enough for me to understand what was coming. Meredith, I have a 7 a.m. shift tomorrow, she said. You know how I am when I don't get enough sleep. I said I knew. She said she hoped I felt better soon. She hung up. I sat there for a moment listening to the silence in my ear. Then I called my sister. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I texted her. The 2 gray checkmarks never turned blue. The thing is, I wasn't even surprised. That's the part that gets me even now, sitting here 2 years later trying to make sense of all of it. I wasn't surprised. I had spent 31 years being the person in my family who was fine, who handled things, who didn't need anything. And the one time I called at 11:30 at night from an emergency room, genuinely not fine, the people I had driven 2 hours to help move apartments, the people I had lent money to that was never paid back, the people I had shown up for in every ordinary and extraordinary way I knew how. They were busy. They were tired. It wasn't a good time. I put my phone face down on the chair beside me and stared at the water stain on the ceiling tile directly above me and thought, okay, I'll figure it out. I had been having stomach pain for 3 days, the kind that starts dull and then sharpens. I'd ignored it the way I ignored most things about myself. I had a deadline at work, a performance review coming up, a lease renewal I kept forgetting to sign. The pain got worse on a Wednesday night. Bad enough that I sat on the bathroom floor at 2 in the morning pressing my fist against my side. By Thursday afternoon I couldn't stand up straight. My coworker, the woman who sat in the cubicle directly across from mine, who had been bringing me ginger tea and side-eyeing me all week, finally said with that particular calm that means someone is actually worried, Meredith, I'm taking you to the hospital right now and I don't want to hear anything about it. Her name was Lacey. We had worked together for 14 months. We got coffee sometimes. We complained about the same manager. She knew I took oat milk and that I hated the way the office printer always jammed on her print jobs specifically, like it had a personal grudge against her. That was more or less the extent of it. We weren't close in the way I thought of closeness. She wasn't someone I would have called at 11:30 at night, but she was the one who drove me to the emergency room that Thursday. She was the one who sat with me through triage and held my insurance card while I filled out forms and asked the nurse in a very direct way that I was too foggy to manage myself, exactly how long the wait was going to be and whether that was going to change if my pain level went up. She had a quiet, competent way of handling a situation that I found deeply reassuring when I was in too much pain to handle anything myself. When they finally took me back and told me it was my appendix and that I needed surgery, she was the one sitting in the waiting room. I found this out later. She had called her husband to say she'd be late, posted in the work group chat that she was out of office, and settled in with a book she had in her bag. She didn't tell me any of this while it was happening. She just stayed. After the surgery, when I was groggy and vaguely nauseated from the anesthesia and wearing a hospital bracelet that had my name spelled wrong, she was the first face I saw. She had gotten me a cup of ice chips because she had asked someone what I would likely want when I woke up, and that was what they said. She had a very practical approach to caring for people that I had never seen before in my life. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't posted on social media. She just did the thing that needed to be done, and then she sat back down and picked up her book. "You didn't have to stay," I told her, still half asleep. "I know," she said, and turned a page. I cried a little, which I blamed on the anesthesia. I'm not sure she believed me, but she didn't make a big deal out of it. She drove me home 2 days later. She carried my discharge paperwork and my prescription and the sad little bag of belongings I'd brought to the hospital, including the cardigan I now hated because of what it reminded me of, and she helped me get settled on my couch and left me with her number written on a post-it note stuck to the side of my laptop with instructions to text her if I needed anything from the pharmacy or the grocery store. "Lacey," I said, "why are you doing this?" She looked at me for a moment. "Because you would have done it for me," she said. I thought about that for a long time after she left. I thought about whether it was true. I thought about the fact that no one in my actual family had come. My mother, who I called on her birthday every year without fail. My sister, who I had helped through a breakup so bad she couldn't get out of bed for a week. I had shown up for them, and they had not shown up for me. And a woman I barely knew had stayed in a hospital waiting room for 6 hours with a book and gotten me ice chips and asked about my pain management schedule before she left. I thought about what that said about the shape of my life, about who I had chosen to prioritize and who had chosen me back. I recovered. It took a couple of weeks. Lacey texted to check on me. My mother called once, 4 days after the surgery, to tell me that she'd heard I was doing better now and that it all worked out. My sister sent a gif of a cartoon bear waving. I stared at it for a while and then put my phone down and went back to my book. When I went back to work, something had shifted. I don't know how else to describe it. I looked at things differently. I started noticing what I was putting in and what I was getting back. I started noticing whose calls I dreaded and why. I started noticing that I had been living a version of my life that was organized around keeping other people comfortable at my own expense, and that this had been going on for so long I had stopped thinking of it as a choice. I had been working at the same marketing firm for 6 years. I was good at my job. I had been passed over for a promotion twice and told both times that I was valuable where I was. I had a manager who took credit for my campaigns and meetings I wasn't invited to, and then CC'd me on the email when the client responded positively. As though that was something. I had a salary that had not kept pace with my workload, and a performance review that said exceeds expectations every single year, and a raise that reflected nothing of the sort. I had also, very quietly, been working on something on the side for about 2 years. Not a business, exactly. More of a skill. I had always been good at data, patterns, systems, the way numbers told stories if you looked at them right. I had started taking online courses at night, statistics, financial modeling. Eventually, I found my way into something called algorithmic trading, the idea that you could build systems to make decisions based on rules, that you could, if you were patient and disciplined and willing to lose money slowly while you learned, eventually build something that made money consistently. I had started with a very small amount, my own savings. I told no one. Not because I was ashamed, but because I had learned, slowly and then all at once, that people in my life had a way of making me feel foolish for wanting things. I had learned to want things quietly where they couldn't reach. It took longer than I expected. Most of it did, but there were months that were good, and then quarters that were good. And then a year that was good enough that I stopped thinking of it as a hobby and started thinking of it as something else. By the time I went back to work after my surgery, the account I had never told anyone about had grown to something that made me sit very still when I looked at it. Not $54 million. Not lottery numbers. But enough that the math of my life looked completely different than it had 6 months before. Enough that when my manager called me into his office 2 months later and told me that due to restructuring, my position was being eliminated, I sat across from him and felt nothing. Not the panic I would have felt a year earlier, not the desperation. I felt, if anything, a quiet kind of clarity, like something that had been slightly out of focus for a long time had finally sharpened. I thanked him for letting me know. I asked about the severance package. I took the folder of paperwork he slid across the desk and I walked back to my cubicle, and I started putting my personal items into my bag, slowly and without drama. Lacey appeared at the edge of my cubicle about 4 minutes later. She had heard. News in that office traveled the way news travels in every small enclosed space, immediately and completely. "Are you okay?" she said. "I think I actually am," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "Do you want to get lunch?" We went to the Thai place 2 blocks away that we'd talked about going to for months and never actually gone to. We ordered too much food and talked for 2 hours. I didn't tell her about the account, but I told her some of the rest, about my mother's phone call, about my sister's gift, about the way I had started thinking, since the hospital, about the difference between the people who showed up and the people who didn't. "I think I've been confusing obligation with love," I said, which was something I'd been turning over in my head for weeks. Lacey was quiet for a moment. "I think a lot of people do," she said. "I think it's actually very hard to tell the difference when you've been taught that they're the same thing." I looked at her across a table covered in too many appetizers and thought about how I had spent 31 years trying to earn love from people who had decided I didn't deserve it, and how this person, this woman I'd worked across from for over a year without really seeing, had shown up for me in the most practical and genuine way I had ever experienced. "Lacey," I said, "I want to tell you something, but I need you to not make a big deal out of it." She put down her fork. "Okay." I told her about the account, not the exact number, not yet, just that I had been building something quietly for 2 years and that it had grown into something real, and that I didn't need the severance package the way my manager thought I did, and that I was, for the first time in my adult life, genuinely free to decide what came next. She was quiet for a long moment. "How long have you been sitting on this?" she said. "About 8 months of knowing it was real," I said, "and about 6 years of building toward it without knowing if it would work." She shook her head slowly. Not with disbelief, more with something like recognition. "You did all of this alone," she said, "while working full-time and dealing with all of that." "I didn't have anyone to tell," I said, which was true in the way that the most honest things tend to be simple. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand once, briefly, and then let go and picked up her fork again. That was so entirely Lacey that I almost laughed. I didn't move fast after that. That's not my nature. I spent 3 months being methodical. I met with a financial advisor. I met with a lawyer. I set up the right structures, made the right decisions, moved slowly and carefully the way I had learned to move with everything that mattered. I also spent a lot of those 3 months thinking about my family. My mother called occasionally. These conversations had a particular texture. She would talk about herself for most of it, circle around to something she needed help with, and close with a version of, "You've always been so capable, Meredith," which I'd once taken as a compliment and now recognized as the thing people say when they want you to keep doing things for them without complaint. My sister sent texts when she needed advice or a favor. She didn't ask about my health. She didn't ask about my job. I'm not sure she knew I'd been laid off. I want to be precise about what happened next, because I've told this story to a couple of people, and they always get this part wrong. It wasn't about revenge. I want to be clear about that. I am not a person who is interested in making other people feel small. I have never wanted that. What I wanted, what I had wanted my entire life, and only recently let myself admit, was to be seen accurately. To have the people who claim to love me understand who I actually was. So when my mother called in January to tell me about a family situation, which turned out to be that my sister needed money, a significant amount of money, because she had made a series of financial decisions that had caught up with her, I did not immediately say no. I sat with it. I thought about it honestly. And then I asked my mother a question. "When I was in the hospital," I said, "in October, why didn't you come?" There was a pause. "Meredith." I explained that at the time. You had a 7 a.m. shift, I said. I remember. Another pause. I don't understand why you're bringing this up now. I'm bringing it up, I said carefully. Because I want to understand how you make decisions about who gets your help and when. My mother's voice shifted into a register I recognized, slightly wounded, slightly impatient. I don't think that's a fair question. I think it's the most fair question I've ever asked you, I said. She didn't have an answer. We ended the call shortly after. My sister texted me the next day asking if I'd talked to our mother and whether I was going to help. I asked her the same question, why she hadn't responded to my messages from the hospital. She said she hadn't seen them. I checked. The read receipts were there, from 11:48 p.m. that night. I didn't point that out. There wasn't anything left to say. I didn't cut anyone off dramatically. That's not who I am either. I simply stopped making myself available. I stopped calling first. I stopped anticipating needs that were never anticipated for me. I let the relationships find their natural level, which, it turned out, was very close to nothing. What I did instead was start paying attention to what I actually wanted. I had always wanted to live somewhere with a porch. I don't know why that specifically. I grew up in apartments, had always lived in apartments. But I had this image in my head of a porch with chairs and something to drink, and a view of trees, and I had never let myself want it out loud because it seemed impractical. I found the house in March. It had a wraparound porch and an overgrown garden and a kitchen that needed work, and I loved it immediately in the way you love things that feel like they were waiting for you. I also, quietly, set up a college fund for Lacey's daughter. She has a daughter, 7 years old, gap-toothed, obsessed with marine biology. I had met her twice, briefly, at work events. Lacey mentioned once, offhandedly, that she was already trying to figure out how to save for college on their current income, with the self-deprecating laugh people use when they're talking about something that genuinely worries them. I didn't make a big announcement. I didn't present it as a gift or a gesture. I had my lawyer set it up as an educational trust, and I told Lacey about it in the same Thai restaurant we'd gone to the day I was laid off, in the same matter-of-fact way that she had told me she was staying at the hospital. She stared at me for a long time. Meredith, she said. I know, I said. Why, she said. Because, I said. You sat in a hospital waiting room for 6 hours and got me ice chips, and nobody in my family did, and I think that deserves to be acknowledged. She cried. I had not expected that. Lacey is not a crier, in my experience. But she cried, just briefly, and then she pressed her hands flat on the table the way she does when she's composing herself. And she said, You didn't have to do that. I know, I said. That's actually the point. Here is what I know now that I didn't know at 31. Showing up is a choice. It is always a choice. The people who love you choose to show up, and the people who don't have reasons that sound reasonable but are ultimately just choices dressed up in explanations. You are allowed to notice the difference. You are allowed to let it change how you see things. I'm not estranged from my family. We talk sometimes. The conversations are shorter now and more honest because I no longer fill the silence with effort. My mother knows something has changed, though I don't think she understands what or why. She is not a person who looks closely at things that make her uncomfortable. My sister called me in April, 2 years after the hospital, to say that she'd heard from someone that I'd bought a house and that she was glad I was doing well. It was the nicest thing she'd said to me in memory. I thanked her and told her I was glad too, and I meant it. Because I am. That's the thing I want to be clear about, more than anything else. I am not sitting in my beautiful house on my porch with my view of the trees feeling bitter. I sat with the bitterness for a while. I think you have to let it tell you what it knows before you can put it down. And then I let it go. Not because the people who hurt me deserve to be let off the hook, but because I deserve to be free of it. Lacey and her family came over for dinner last month. Her daughter spent 20 minutes explaining to me the difference between dolphins and porpoises with a level of intensity I found genuinely impressive. Lacey and I sat on the porch afterward with glasses of wine while the sun went down and talked about nothing important for a long time, which is one of my favorite things to do now. Something I am learning, slowly, to be good at. I don't think the story I came from defines me. I think I was shaped by it, the way everyone is shaped by the family they were born into and the choices those people made. But I am not those shapes anymore. I have been, in these past 2 years, very slowly, becoming someone new. Someone who knows what she's worth. Someone who doesn't wait to be chosen by people who've already decided. Someone who shows up because that's who I am, and who finally has people in her life who do the same. If you're sitting somewhere right now recognizing something in this story, I want you to hear me say, the people who show up for you in the worst moments are telling you the truth about love. And the people who don't, they're telling you the truth too. Believe both of them. I've thought a lot about why things turned out the way they did. Not in a mystical sense. I don't think the universe was keeping score, or that some invisible hand was arranging pieces on a board. I think it's simpler than that, and in some ways harder to sit with. The way your life turns out has a lot to do with what you quietly choose to do when no one is watching and nothing is guaranteed. I spent 6 years building something in the dark. No applause, no encouragement. Most nights I was tired from a full day of work and I still sat down and kept learning, kept adjusting, kept going even when the account went sideways for 3 months straight and I had every reason to quit. That wasn't luck. That was a decision I made over and over again in ordinary moments that didn't feel significant at the time. That's what I mean when I think about intelligence. Not the kind that shows up on tests, but the kind that keeps you sitting at the table when the results aren't coming yet. The kind that says, I don't know if this will work, but I'm going to understand it fully before I decide. And I think about Lacey. About what it actually cost her to stay in that waiting room. She had a husband at home. A daughter. A life that needed her. She stayed anyway, not because she owed me anything, not because she expected something back, but because she looked at a situation and decided that the right thing was to be present. That's a moral choice, a quiet one, the kind that doesn't get recognized in the moment and sometimes doesn't get recognized at all. The fact that it was recognized in this case. That's not magic, that's just what happens when someone who notices things finally has the means to act on what they've noticed. My mother and my sister made choices too. Every time they didn't pick up. Every time they filled the silence with reasons. Those choices were also consistent, also deliberate in their own way. Also the product of who they had decided to be over a long time. I don't say this to be cruel. I say it because I think we sometimes want there to be a dramatic villain in these stories. A moment of pure malice we can point to. But mostly it's just a pattern of small decisions. Of not showing up. Of choosing comfort over inconvenience, over and over, until that becomes simply who you are. What I know now is that resilience isn't something you have. It's something you practice in the specific conditions of your actual life. In the rejection, in the loneliness, in the years when no one sees what you're building, and you have to be enough of a witness to yourself to keep going. I had to learn to be that witness. It didn't come naturally, but I learned it. And I know that the life I have now, the porch, the house, the dinner table where Lacey's daughter explains marine biology to me with complete seriousness, none of it came from waiting to be chosen. It came from choosing, from deciding slowly and without announcement, that I was worth the effort I had been pouring into everyone else. That is not a lesson I can teach anyone, but it is one I hope, if you're somewhere in the middle of your own quiet building, that you let yourself believe,